There are few more dangerous places in the world than the lawless border region between Pakistan and Afghanistan. What can the U.S. and its allies do to tame the warlords, jihadis, and Taliban factions who operate there? Next on Great Decisions.
In a democracy, agreement is not essential, but participation is. Join us as we discuss today's most critical global issues. Join us for Great Decisions. Great Decisions is produced by the Foreign Policy Association, inspiring Americans to learn more about the world.
Funding for Great Decisions is provided by the Star Foundation. Great Decisions is produced in association with the University of Delaware.
If another terrorist attack on the scale of 9/11 is being cooked up, many people believe that it's happening in the tribal borderlands between Pakistan and Afghanistan.
I'm certain that bin Laden is on the Afghan-Pakistan border, but given the fact that the Afghan-Pakistan border is 1,500 miles long, which is the distance between Washington, D.C. and Denver, that's a pretty long border.
The region has always been a treacherous place: steep, rocky mountains, dusty valleys, few laws, and little industry. The biggest business is smuggling, guns, and heroin. Villages are widely scattered, and the Pashtuns living in them are isolated, impoverished, and mostly illiterate.
The tribal areas of Pakistan are among the most neglected areas in terms of social to economic development.
But this gloomy territory has been a chessboard where great powers have waged contests of high-stakes conspiracy and global brinksmanship. That was true when the British and Russian empires fought there in the 19th century, and a century later in the Cold War, when the U.S. battled and defeated the Soviet Empire by arming local tribesmen and foreign fighters. Many of those U.S. allies would later become known as the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. After 9/11 and the American invasion of Afghanistan, the Taliban and Al-Qaeda again retreated to Pakistan's tribal belt. Today, the region has become a sanctuary for hundreds, perhaps thousands of militants.
7 years later, the United States is embroiled in an increasingly hot war in Afghanistan, a more deadly war than in Iraq in terms of Allied casualties and indeed civilian casualties as well.
From mountain outposts in Pakistan, fighters are launching cross-border attacks into Afghanistan. From Afghanistan, NATO and its allies are firing back. The skirmishes have grown more frequent and deadly. Suicide bombings have claimed hundreds of lives, civilian and military. In the U.S., there is talk of shifting troops from Iraq back to Afghanistan.
Taliban have used villages. They go in and hide among the civilians. They go into farmhouses and start shooting out from those. And, you know, when our forces are attacked, they fight back.
Pakistan, home to 170 million people, a nuclear arsenal, and a relatively new government, is racked by ethnic violence and political unrest. The crisis in the borderlands may indeed be beyond the weak government's control.
Make no mistake about it, this key American Western ally is a very fragile place right now.
More and more, Afghans and Americans are conducting strikes into Pakistani territory, but a large-scale attack in the tribal belt by Pakistan or the U.S. could easily tip the region into chaos. Border Patrol, Pakistan and Afghanistan, coming up next on Great Decisions.
And now from our studios, here is Ralph Begleiter.
Welcome to Great Decisions. I'm Ralph Begleiter. Joining us to discuss the border region between Pakistan and Afghanistan are Pamela Constable, Deputy Foreign Editor at The Washington Post and author of the book Fragments of Grace, and Daniel Markey, Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and a former State Department policy planner during the Bush administration. Thank you both for being with us on Great Decisions. You've both been many times, and Pamela, in your case, for a long time, lived and covered the area we're talking about between Afghanistan and Pakistan. What's it like? Why do people say it's ungovernable and wilderness and a wild, bad land? Pam?
Well, I always say that if you travel along the Grand Trunk Road from Islamabad, the capital of Pakistan, back up to the tribal region, it's like a journey going backward in time. You go from the capital, and as you travel along the road, you see fewer men in trousers and more men in the long flowing tunics. You see fewer women's faces and more women covered with veils, fewer cars and more horse carts. And by the time you actually get up to the tribal regions, where in fact foreign journalists are not allowed to go, and I've only snuck in a couple of times, you really feel that you're in another century. Everyone you see, in fact, you see no women at all, and so everyone you see is a man wandering around in a long, loose, flowing gown, often with a beard, and often, very often, just simply carrying a rifle over their shoulder, and that's the way they live in the tribal areas.
Dan, you've been there too?
Yeah, I would say Pam's description is right in terms of the geography and the people. One of the points I would just make is that what's very different about at least Pakistan's tribal areas is that this is a place that is governed by tribal laws and has a very different relationship with the state of Pakistan than the rest of the country. And so trying to understand what's happening, and this is in particular in the federally administered tribal areas right along the border with Afghanistan, requires an understanding of the nature of that relationship, which in some ways is more colonial in terms of almost an imperial Islamabad interacting with tribal leadership than it is a modern state. And so that influences anything and everything that can happen within that area, I think, quite significantly.
Can you even tell where the border is in that region? Is it all formally demarked and everything?
The border between Pakistan and Afghanistan, yes. That border is I believe, at times very difficult to discern, except on official border crossing areas where it is clear, and there are now border crossing posts along most of those roads. But elsewhere, it's very difficult, and the people living there, in many cases, don't actually accept the nature of that border in any meaningful sense.
Great Decision spoke to a number of other observers of the region as well. Let's hear what some of them have to say.
It's very convenient to say that, oh, you know, for centuries these tribal regions have been beyond our control, and yet we know that military forces have been able to go there. The question is whether there is a consensus in the political realm and the military and the intelligence realm in Pakistan, a consensus on what to do for the stability of their own country and for the stability of the region.
The only way we're going to solve the terrorism problem is to bring these areas under government control, but also to have both sides fighting the terrorists and trying to develop these areas.
The United States can't solve Afghan, Pakistani suspicions of each other, but what the United States can do is say, look, we're going to be in Afghanistan for a very long time. The reason the Pakistani establishment, or Pakistani military to some degree, tolerates the Pakistani Taliban's presence on its territory is they're not convinced that the United States is going to be in Afghanistan forever, and they think that having the Pakistani Taliban as a sort of insurance policy for the day the United States withdraws.
Kabul alone cannot address it, Islamabad alone cannot address it. But history has shown when Kabul and Islamabad come together coherently, they can match the politics of the tribal area and bring a different perspective.
Let me ask you at this point, you've got NATO forces operating in the area, you've got American forces operating in the area, Pakistan has a substantial military, I don't think Afghanistan's military is all that substantial. Who is in charge in this region, if anybody? Pam?
In some ways, there are too many actors. You've had, you know, great difficulty coordinating U.S. and NATO operations within Afghanistan. You've had, you know, recently, in recent months, increasing tensions between the United States and Pakistan over whether this whole issue of U.S. unmanned planes and also now increasingly actual human beings crossing from Afghanistan among U.S. forces into Pakistan's tribal areas to go after particular militant fighters or militant locations is causing enormous tensions with Pakistan, and Pakistani authorities protested very vigorously about this. So even though in theory and in statements everyone's on the same page, you do have, you know, a great deal of difficulty with coordination. The Pakistani military, in many ways, still sees its primary mission as defending Pakistan from India, not from anyone else. And so they've not been trained in counterinsurgency. They don't necessarily, even now, consider that their own fundamentalist, violent militant groups are a major threat to them. It's been very difficult. It's like the Titanic. It's very hard to shift a very large military establishment from one way of thinking to another.
I've got to ask you a simple question, Dan, and you may think this is overly simplistic, but I think many Americans might ask themselves, why are we even meddling in this area? Why are there American forces in that region? Are bad plots being hatched against the Americans in that region? What other consequences, what other things are going on there that are bringing all this turmoil to bear on this one region?
Well, the short answer is 9/11 is what brought us to this region. We were not in this region in any significant way before 9/11. And in particular, we were not in Afghanistan, and our relationship with Pakistan was very limited, to say the least. Now that we're there because the problems that brought us there, the al-Qaeda problem of planning global terrorism, has remained. It has not been defeated, and in many ways it has moved and shifted and morphed and in some ways grown in the tribal areas, in particular in Pakistan's tribal areas, to become something even perhaps more threatening, which is a localized insurgency built upon a terrorist network that threatens the stability of the Pakistani state, and to the extent, and threatens our ambitions for Afghanistan as well, which would be a stable state there. So there is a problem of instability in the region, and one reason we care about that is the fact that Pakistan, as you mentioned in your opener, is a nuclear state. And the idea of a nuclear state being destabilized fundamentally is something that would be troubling to the United States, certainly to India, to China, to the broader region, to the globe.
Got to come back to something you said at the very beginning of this answer, which was the United States was not in Afghanistan. It was in Pakistan in only a limited way. I think if you said that to people who live in the region we're talking about, they were saying, are you kidding? The United States was in Afghanistan in the 1980s. The United States was in Afghanistan in the 1970s. They have longer memories, don't they? And doesn't that bear on the current situation, Pam?
There's a great deal of love-hate. I mean, one of my favorite anecdotes is I can remember being in Pakistan a few years ago, and I had just come from covering some huge anti-American demonstrations where young men coming out of these religious academies were stomping on effigies of President Bush, and, you know, because Bush and Musharraf rhymed, they were sort of doing this sort of anti-Bush, anti-Mush kind of very, very angry and violent demonstrations. And then I went to the capital, Islamabad, and the line outside the U.S. consulate for work visas stretched around the entire block. I mean, this is a country that has had this sort of push-pull with the United States for a very long time. In Afghanistan, it's even more aggravated because, as we were saying earlier, you know, up until 1989, when the Soviets were in Afghanistan, there was a huge American involvement and push there. And one of the things the Afghans always said after that was, why did they abandon us? And now that the Americans and the West are back in Afghanistan, the same concerns have been expressed repeatedly by Afghans. They think we're going to leave them again.
Let me ask you the question from the American point of view, American citizen point of view, who is looking at the region through gauze, perhaps, and not a lot of detail, and they think, oh, Al-Qaeda is there, Bin Laden is there, Islamic extremists are there, and that's the reason why the United States should be there. Do you think that's true? Do we know at this point whether Al-Qaeda still operates in the region? Could it be operating elsewhere? Does anybody really even know if Bin Laden and all those people who engaged in the 9/11 attacks really are still operating in that region? Dan?
I would say there's very good reason to believe that, yes, the answer is absolutely, that Al-Qaeda continues to have core operations and core leadership based in the tribal areas. And that they have not been dislodged. And although Bin Laden himself has been relatively scarce of late, and I'm sure nobody knows precisely where he is except for him and a few other people, Zawahiri in 2008 released a tape to the Pakistani people.
He's Bin Laden's number two.
Number two, yeah. That was directed very firmly at the Pakistani citizens and explaining to them why they needed essentially to stand up both to their leaders and to stand up to the United States and to stand with the jihadis and with Al-Qaeda. And so it's clear that Al-Qaeda itself, at least in this tape, sees that region as central to their ambitions for their movement.
Let's come back to something that both of you have touched on a bit here now. Let's move on to the idea of, okay, we understand the region a little bit. What can be done? What would have to be done to the region, to assist the region, to the people in the region, to help solve this continuing problem? We spoke with a number of other people as well about that. Let's listen to what they have to say.
Whether it be education, whether it be democracy building and political institution building, whether it be water, farming, economy, all of that, the first thing is security. And almost we have to go back to the drawing board in Afghanistan because we let the promising beginnings drop.
One of the key reasons why many areas, not only in Pakistan, but particularly in Afghanistan, that the situation is so unstable is that what was promised to them after the fall of the Taliban has not been delivered. And much of that obviously is because in order to conduct development effectively, you need stability.
The tribal areas of Pakistan are among the most neglected areas in terms of social to economic development. So a comprehensive plan that would involve cooperation across the line among the two countries is essential to providing opportunities for uplifting of conditions.
The problem isn't easy to deal with because it's not just a military problem, it's a domestic problem. So you can't just go in and kill people. You've got to have a counterinsurgency strategy where you protect the population, you separate out the irreconcilables, you provide reconstruction aid in the areas that these militants are operating in. So, and as we've seen in Iraq, that is not an easy thing to fix simultaneously. However, you can do it. I mean, it can be done.
We think that if you can open up economic opportunities, kids can get jobs instead of picking up guns. You got to expand and improve the education system so kids go to public school instead of madrasas. You got to build the institutions that can guarantee democracy. So in the end, there's a democratic opportunity here that means that we ought to be doing what we've been doing, plus new things. And there's sentiment even on Capitol Hill for doing that.
Pam, let me ask you, the people of Afghanistan, the people in this border region, the people of Pakistan, don't really trust the United States, as you indicated earlier. How can we, as a nation, build that trust so that Taliban and al-Qaeda won't have the political strength they do have in the region?
I think there really needs to be sort of a two-pronged strategy. As some of the speakers were saying, it can't just be a military policy. It has to be, military plus what comes after. You go into a tribal area with a military operation. If you're killing or arresting bad guys, creating refugees, creating fear, you need to be able to go in very quickly and then do something that people will appreciate. And even then, that may be enough. But it has to happen. You can't just do it one way. And one of the things that has been happening, that happened in 2008 in Afghanistan, and to a certain extent in Pakistan also, is that the issue of civilian casualties at the hands of foreign Western troops has become something that's been blown way, way out of proportion and has turned what was a very welcoming populace more and more against foreign forces. There have been a series of bombings of villages. We don't have time to go into the details. In most cases, apparently Taliban or insurgents were fighting in the villages were bombed. But then what the people hear about is that civilians were killed. And the reaction from the public...
And is that not right?
It's true that civilians have been killed, but the numbers are very small. I'm not saying it's a good thing. I'm simply saying that the times it has happened, the numbers of people killed are quite small, but the reaction, the political, the emotional, the psychological reaction in the country has been huge. So it's something that the West can't afford to let happen. It can't afford to alienate the people it's trying to help.
Dan, do you want to comment on how the U.S. can help build trust among Afghans and Pakistanis?
Well, first and foremost, I'd pick up on something that Peter Bergen said in his segment, which is essentially that they don't believe that we're going to stick around for very long. And that is partially because the United States is in some ways constitutionally incapable of guaranteeing that it will do anything for very long. Quite literally, it can't tell other countries that it will do things or budget multi-year without congressional consent. And so it's hard to send signals that the United States government will be in a place for 5 years, 10 years, past the current any current presidential administration. So that's something that we need to try to send better signals in that respect. Invest in ways that look to the people of the country that we intend to be there with our personnel and with our resources. And the other point I would just make is that this is a question of development, of building roads and schools and wells and so on and so forth. It's also a question of governance, though. It's a question of having structures, institutional structures in place, Afghan structures or Pakistani structures that can come in and govern in ways that these states have not known, and in some cases have never known, historically have never had. And so that's a tremendously difficult thing, and it's especially difficult for us to do from the outside. We don't have good policy tools to do it. We haven't invested in these kinds of things. This is a tremendously challenging, ambitious agenda. If we intend to do it, we're going to have to be at it for a while.
We've talked a little bit about the challenges for the United States so far. Let's see what some of our other experts and observers have to say about what the U.S. could do.
It's going to require a huge amount of effort by the United States and its allies to really rebuild this relationship and to really figure out how to get Pakistan and Afghanistan back on an even keel to try to address the really pressing issues there. Because if Pakistan and Afghanistan are lost, I mean, you might as well kiss goodbye to stability in that region.
Were that capability to be mobilized to look at the region coherently, and particularly to look in Afghanistan and Pakistan together rather than two islands, and then bring Europe, Japan, and China to a strategic partnership that really aims minimally at 10 years of building capable states and functioning markets in the region, the future could be bright. Otherwise, the danger of chaos is very real.
There's a new Pakistani administration, there's a new American administration, there's also a new military leadership at CENTCOM, which is the US military command in charge of Afghanistan and Pakistan, which is General Petraeus, who just came from Iraq. So I think there's a possibility that there will be a major strategic rethink about what we should be doing in Afghanistan.
For 200 years, Afghan's been a bloc, and now it's going to be an open hub. And that's the real goal. And to help Afghan achieve that, we've got to stabilize Afghanistan and Pakistan. And then we've got to start opening up the routes for electricity and roads and trucks and all that stuff. We're working on that at the same time.
Does Taliban in Afghanistan have a political future? Is it going to run out of steam, or is it going to gain in political stature? Is the United States going to be fighting Taliban for a long time? Pam?
I think so. I think that, and not just me, many experts and officials are now saying in recent months that this is looking like a tougher and tougher fight to win. And there was a window of opportunity that lasted about 4 years after the Taliban was first overthrown, in which things were going very well. Schools were opening. You got this feeling. Elections were held. A new constitution was written. Women were voting. There was a very positive momentum. But in around 2006, it began to turn the other way, and the Taliban really have come back very strongly and basically have built on what some of us were saying earlier in the program. Expectations have not been met. Expectations for security, for development, and particularly for justice have not been met. And so many Afghans are very disillusioned with the government and, by extension, its supporters abroad. And so the Taliban have come in and have been filling that void. They've not only been intimidating and abusing and committing atrocities, they've also been winning hearts and minds.
Dan, you were in government in the United States during the mid-2000s when this was all very much front and center for Americans. And we don't know what will happen by the time our viewers see this program, but if bin Laden were to be killed or captured, if al-Qaeda would be somehow visibly wiped out or whatever, would Americans feel their expectations have been met and, okay, we can pull the plug on all this?
Well, I think some Americans would. I think a very narrow view of the region is one that places al-Qaeda as the only issue and believes that the decapitation of al-Qaeda leadership would essentially mean that we can pick up and go home. And I think that that would be to miss the fact that there was a reason why al-Qaeda has found this region to be fairly warm and receptive, which is that there's an underlying alienation, and there is an underlying potential for extremism. And there are existing networks, both criminal networks and terrorist networks, sectarian networks, that can be exploited by a variety of different kind of terrorist groups and insurgencies. And so to neglect that and to believe that just by eliminating a few individuals that you've solved that problem would be entirely wrong. What really needs to happen is the United States needs to take a much longer term approach, as a number of the segments have suggested, and recognize that this place needs to be transformed into an area that is more impervious to the development of these kinds of networks, because it is very hard to contain them. It's very hard to essentially wall off this area from the rest of the world. So if the place can't be shut off from the rest of the world, it needs to be turned into something that's much less dangerous.
Pamela Constable, Deputy Foreign Editor of The Washington Post and author of Fragments of Grace, and Daniel Markey, Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and a former State Department policy planner during the Bush administration. Thank you both for being with us. And thank you as well for joining us on Great Decisions. We'll see you next time. I'm Ralph Begleiter.
To learn more about topics discussed on Great Decisions, visit our website at www.greatdecisions.tv. To order a copy of the Great Decisions Briefing Book, a DVD set of this series, or join a Great Decisions discussion group in your area, contact the Foreign Policy Association. Funding for Great Decisions is provided by the Star Foundation. Great Decisions is produced in association with the University of Delaware.
Next time on Great Decisions. According to the Guinness Book of World Records, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is the most translated document in history. But 60 years after coming into force, atrocities continue to occur. Is human rights a lost cause or a vital beacon of hope? Next time on Great Decisions.